So shalom and welcome back again. This wasn't really going to be my next lesson, but it seems like I encounter this all the time when I'm having discussions, and I just keep coming into this. So let's play Mythbuster. The Jews killed Jesus, and or the Pharisees are the bad guys. These two go hand in hand, and I have discussions with people, even people who are well informed. When we're having discussions, these 2 points usually come up some kind of way. So let's start basic and break it down. And don't attack me over my terrible usage of Greek. So we're going to look at Judah, Judea. This is all during Greek antiquity and the Galilean regions. So the term for which usually the Jews, which is Ioudaios or Ioudaios, first occurs in 2 Kings 16:6. As a member of Judah and one of his descendants, Ioudaios. So this in its original Hebrew is Yehuda, Judah. This would translate from the Greek to the English for the term Jews. Ioudaios is actually the Greek form of the place named Ioudaios or Ioudaios, which is Latinized from Judea. As I said, Yehuda. So a person of this region became known in Hebrew as Yehudai, or the plural Yahudim. So the Greeks translate this word of the persons from this area as Ioudaios or Yehuda. Again, so the Greek form of all these words occurs about 200 times in the New Testament. In Matthew 5 times, Mark 7 times, Luke 5 times, and in John 71 times. So let's get an understanding that when John was actually supposedly writing the Gospels, this would have been around the end of the 1st century, and it would have been in Asia Minor, which is important. So the Jewish people that were all over the land of Israel, and even the ones that were scattered all across the Mediterranean regions, would have been known by this phrase. And even the occupying Romans would use this title when referring to them. So let's look at the examples. Looking in John 7:1. John states that Jesus was staying in Galilee, and he chose not to go into Ioudaios because the Ioudaios were seeking to kill him. Now the word here gives the distinction between the Galilean region and the Galilean Jews and the Judean regions. Now the problem in this is in English that this translates the Jews wanted to kill him. And a fact that this was strategically used by the Roman Catholic Church to give off the impression that continues today and throughout the church that the Jews are actually the bad guys. So now in John 11:7, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let us return to the Ioudaios." The disciples responded using the English teacher in most Bibles. The Jews tried to stone you. Or why are we returning there? The Jews tried to stone you. So by using context, this translates as Judean. Now that's bringing us to the next definition in these words. The hoi or how Ioudaios. This generally translates to mean both the priestly and the scribal leadership. That means this is the sages, this is the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So we see when Jesus is coming into Bethany to raise Lazarus, we see that it says that it states there are many members of the Ioudaios, which is many Jews, who had come to visit Mary, saw what Jesus did, and believed in him. So the Bible uses both here. It uses the Jews who saw and believed, and it also uses the Jews who went to the Pharisees to report what Jesus had done. So with the misusing of these words, this gives us an interpretation that's widely used and widely believed when we read that the chief priests stirred up the crowd and the Jews yelled, "Crucify him." Also, noting many Bibles use some of the leaders stirred up the crowd. So this brings us to the point that this was used as one of the many misrepresentations of the Pharisees, making them the antagonist and the villains of Jesus. The Christians point out a lot that Jesus was always fighting with the Pharisees. It's a whole nother lesson and argument I'll give later. So this thought is still widely viewed and taught within all denominations. Even many of the churches that, keeping with the fad, like to hang up the Jewish flag. These are bred-in teachings that all have, and even without knowing or realizing. Due to centuries of the Catholic Church's influence over the world and influence over all the denominations that would arise out of it. The fact is that every single denomination, from Baptist to Pentecostal to the non-denominational, really doesn't matter. You're all Catholic at the core, whether you realize it or acknowledge it or not. This translation is also the case in 1 Thessalonians 2:14, where we see Paul with saying, "You suffered from your own people the same things those churches in Jerusalem suffered from the Jews, who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and also drove us out." This, which is completely taken out of context. Again, this is only talking about the strict religious types such as the Sadducees. There were many different sects of Judaism throughout the entire Mediterranean. Each of them fought amongst themselves. You have, which we know, the religiously strict Christian Jews who wanted to follow law, fighting against the ones who thought we didn't need law, plus mixed in with the Gentiles, hence the entire whole thing of the letters of Paul. We know through reading history, anywhere in that time, you can see that there were strict observant Jewish synagogues that were arguing against the Christian synagogues all the time. And just as a cultural or historical or religious fact, the crowd could not have even been made up of all Jews, because we know it's taken place during Passover. And they would have been at home preparing for Passover. They wouldn't have been out in the middle of the streets hanging out in crowds in front of the Romans. The gospel gives many, many accounts and instances of just how much the Jewish people loved Jesus and followed Jesus, and how many followers he had. He had thousands of followers. We see when Jesus comes in, like at the Sermon on the Mount, there's thousands or hundreds of Jews show up. People welcome him. Every time he comes to town, they're coming in crowds to see him. So the Jews loved Jesus, not all of them, but again, this doesn't pertain to the entirety as a whole. Jesus himself points this out when he's being arrested, when he says that I've sat in the temple teaching every day and yet was not ceased. We even have historical Jewish quotes with a great parallel to other Jewish teachers. Jesus taught in the temple courtyards, like that of the Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who used to sit and teach daily in the shade of the sanctuary. That's in the Jewish Babylonian Talmud. Even in Matthew, it explicitly explains that if the Jewish leadership arrested Jesus, they feared there would be a riot from the people. That the multitude of the Jews would rise to defend him, Matthew 26, 3 through 5. So we know also that it's actually the Sadducees, it's Caiaphas. Josephus even records that Caiaphas didn't like Jesus. Rome used the Sadducees specifically to keep the Jewish people in line. And historically, they believed that Caiaphas and Pilate actually had a close relationship. And if you're reading in Matthew 26:57, you can actually see that it states that there's actually a small appointed group of the Sadducees leadership that encounters Jesus during Passover. So the Passover rituals don't allow for ceremonial clean Jews to kill someone during the festival. So we know Jesus' arrest was at night. Jesus was taken in early in the morning. This whole thing was an illegal, not done correct trial. None of the Pharisees were there. There's no court appointed, which by Jewish law should be. And actually, observant Torah Jews would not even enter into Pilate's house during Passover to avoid being ritually unclean. Remember, Jews aren't even allowed to enter into a Gentile's home at that time period. And they definitely wouldn't have condemned someone to death during Passover, because doing so would completely undo their Passover sacrifice. So, historically and technically, if you're to examine it with any sense at all, the Jewish people were completely busy doing their purification and preparations for the Passover festival. And the messed up part is that really the New Testament is often read and preached over against Judaism. Jesus, who's always identified as, great and loving, but yet the Pharisees and the rabbinic teachers are always just the evil villains. Now you got to remember, the Pharisees, the rabbis, they're the ones who completely guide all of Judaism. This is a total misinterpretation of Judaism. And to think that they're just running around stoning everyone, that's completely contradictory to the beliefs in Judaism and the Torah law as well. We even have a quote from a Catholic sister, Catholic nun, who says, Christianity fulfills the promises God made to the Jews in the Old Covenant, with one grounded in any biblical scholarship. I also get in this argument a lot where people are always pointing out how, when they're griping about church pastors or preachers on TV or whatever, how Jesus is always condemning the Pharisees. Jesus never actually really condemns the Pharisees. Does Jesus argue with them? Yes. Arguing with Pharisees, arguing with rabbis, even today is just really a common thing. Jewish rabbis argue constantly. And if you read in Deuteronomy, Moses is chastising and rebuking the Israelites for the entire 40 years of the desert and not trusting God going into the promised land. So the same logic would apply, that Moses was against all the Jews. We have to learn how to read and interpret the Bible, how it's wrote, and not how it's been presented to us. So it's about to start the Sabbath today, so Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you next time.